Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and as you can see, it's Tuesday, which means we're doing Meta Mondays. All right. So, okay, listen. I understand you guys are memeing it up. Teehee, Swim never starts on time. Ha ha ha. Good joke. I will say, I have a bit of an excuse this time. I wanted to wait until the patch notes came out. It does occur to me, maybe I should just start doing the segment on a different day of the week. To be honest, I haven't done it on Monday in like 4 weeks, but it's still going to be called, for the time being, Meta Mondays. All right, so in this video, we have patch notes. We are going to be talking about the patch that should be delivered in probably a couple of hours after this video is being released, I believe. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about the patch notes. I'm going to be breaking down what's new, what's different in terms of individual cards, patch note by patch note. Then we're going to hop into the tier list and talk about the new tier list. We're going to be using Mobalytics data from Masters ranks from the last week, but also we're going to extrapolate a little bit in terms of what we expect to be good given the new patch. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, let's go ahead and start with patch notes analysis. So I'm going to be breaking down card by card. Pretty breezy. I'll go through this pretty quick on what's different. Now, this is going to be a little bit more accurate than my initial impressions video I uploaded yesterday, because I've had some time to think about this and talk with a lot of other top players about, where things are going to end up. So Hecarim is getting nerfed by 1 health, and he is also getting his Onslaught of Shadows Riders are going down to 2 power, but in exchange, his level up condition requires 1 less ephemeral attack, and in addition, when he levels up, his aura buff is for 3 attack and not 2. Overall, this is a nerf. The +1 health will matter, and most importantly, the attack on the Spectral Rider means he's not as good without being leveled up. I like this change. It is a bit of a nerf to Hecarim, and he definitely will feel this nerf. He will end up being seeing play in less decks for sure. Kalista gets a bit of a buff slash rework, goes to +1 health to 3 health, and in exchange for not having the +2 attack bond anymore and requiring 1 additional ally to die, she needs 4 allies to die now. Her level up condition basically goes from rezzing with, the +2 bond to reviving an ephemeral unit that takes damage for Kalista on her turn. Overall, as much as I would love to see Kalista performing, I've talked with a lot of people. I know a lot of people are very excited about trying out the new Kalista. I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but this card is still not good. I could make some arguments for this card unironically being worse in this form, actually, which is sad to say, but basically, just to break this down a little bit, for the most part, the +1 health isn't going to do very much for her. The only thing +1 health is going to matter with is effectively, it'll help her survive Mystic Shot, but that's against the one region that will always have a way to deal 3 damage with something like Thermo Beam or Get Excited or a 2-card combo Mystic Shot Static. So it ends up not really helping her survive that. Of course, she's fearsome, so the opponent can't block her with anything that has less than 3 attack as well. So you're effectively playing, and of course, her being harder to level up and not having the +2 attack means she's kind of like an arachnoid horror, but the fearsome tag and like the way the meta works out means the difference between 2 and 3 health is pretty insignificant. Thus, she's kind of like an arachnoid horror that has +1 attack for +1 mana, which of course isn't really great. Arachnoid horror is a card that is seeing cuts from spider decks, which is pretty crazy because it's a valued in spider tag 2-drop. And even in that deck, it's already being pretty cut. A lot of versions of spiders are running 0 arachnoid horrors right now. And we'll get into that later because I'm actually going to show you some versions of spiders. Overall, I hope I'm wrong, but I've talked to a lot of other players. And most people agree that Kalista is pretty underwhelming in her new form as well as her old form. Additionally, some other cards in Shadow Isles are getting nerfed. We'll see that down below. But those are a lot of cards that are helping support Kalista, like spoiler alert, Mark of the Isles is also something that kind of ends up linking with her because they're often running the same kinds of aggro Shadow Isles decks, and certain other cards being nerfed is going to hurt her viability overall. So I expect basically nothing out of this card. Alright, Black Spear. This is another card that happens to nerf Kalista because, of course, Kalista's card is Black Spear. So when you draw 2 Kalistas, you draw a Black Spear. Black Spear gets nerfed to 3 mana. This is probably one of the slightly more confusing nerfs on my end. I think Shadow Isles did need some nerfs in general, but Black Spear seemed to me personally, and to a lot of other top players, because a lot of people agree, to be one of the more fair cards in Shadow Isles. I think it was fairly skill intensive. You had to play around it. I think a lot of decks that ran Black Spear ended up cutting it from a 3 of. It was a 3 of in some Allegiance concept. concepts, but for the most part, outside of Allegiance, you didn't really want to run this card as a 3-of. As opponents like played around it, it started losing a lot of value. It became pretty situational, and the limitation of it pretty rarely being able to be used before combat made it one of the weaker Shadow Isles cards, even though it did see a decent amount of competitive play. I'm down for nerfing some aspects of Shadow Isles, but honestly, this one seemed kind of a little like overkill. But yeah, for the most part, Black Spear is a fairly weak card at this point. It's pretty hard to justify at 3 mana. Border Lookout got the Elite tag. This will change almost nothing. The Battlesmith and the Squire are, as of now, not really competitive level cards, but you will start getting this out of the Silverwing Vanguard, which is pretty funny. Is that what it's called, Silverwing Vanguard? The 5/6 with the... Wait, no, that's not what it's called. Hang on. Hang on. I'm pulling up my game on the side just so I can make sure. Swiftwing Lancer. I had an oopsie. Yeah, you'll start pulling this on the Swiftwing Lancer, of course, which means that it's technically a nerf to Swiftwing Lancer. Then we've got Mage Seeker Insider. This card got a full rework. It is now a 4/4/3, and when you play it, it now, well, it's not a play effect. It is grant me +2/+2 once you've cast a 6+ cost spell this game. So what this means is, whether it's on board or in your hand, as soon as you have registered a cast of a 6+ cost spell, it'll either, if it's on board at that point in time, it'll get buffed, or if it's in your hand, it'll get buffed, and, you know, you'll see the buff when you get to play the card. So whether it's on the board or not, it will effectively pick up this buff once this condition has been met. So effectively, if you haven't played a 6 cost spell or higher, then it's going to be basically a 4 mana 4/3, right? If you have, then it's going to be a 4 mana 6/5. Now, I've looked at this card and I've thought about it quite a bit, and I personally think it's going to be a little bit tricky to run. It is a conditional 4 mana 6/5. There's definitely some interesting ways to run this. One really important thing to understand about Runeterra is that attack points have pretty significant diminishing returns in a way that they don't in a game like Hearthstone because of Defender's Advantage. Your opponent will be able to designate blockers that are going to be able to shut down like large attack point swings. So at the end of the day, the difference between 4 attack and 6 attack is really, really minor. So as cute as a conditional 4 mana 6/5 might be, especially for a defensive style deck, which, you know, kind of like Lux spell heavy Demacia deck is typically going to be, it's not really going to be super tempo-y, so it doesn't really want a high attack stat. This card is going to be a little underwhelming. Obviously, the combo here is you typically want to play Remembrance with this card. Remembrance will allow you to, you know, play the double float or skip your turn on turn 1, skip your turn on turn 2, and then play Remembrance for the 6 total mana on turn 3, and then, of course, on turn 4, you can Mage Seeker for a 4 mana 6/5. I personally think it's a little too conditional and a little too committal to be necessarily great. As cute as a 6/5 is for 4 mana, I don't think it's worth that condition. So ultimately, I think this card is just going to be short of seeing like a lot of competitive play. One interesting way you can use this card, though, is with a Knox deck using like cards like Trifarian Assessor, as well as Remembrance, and even Reckoning, which is also a 6 mana spell. So I might tinker around with something like that, although that's experimental to say the least. Mage Seeker Investigator got a rework as well. As you can see, Mage Seekers now have to, you know, have 6+ cost spells cast, and this one creates a Detain in your hand once that has happened. So that is, I believe, if you've already played a 6+ cost spell this game, then as soon as you play the Mage Seeker, it should create the Detain in your hand, basically, right? That's how that'll work. So the big question is, do you run Mage Seeker over running Detain, or Mage Seeker Investigator, sorry. Do you run this over Detain even? And honestly, it's kind of a tricky question to answer. I think that the immediate answer should be yes. Most people would say yes to that. And the problem with that is a large part of that is comparing it to Vanguard Sergeant, which is also a very similar card. It's a 3/3/3 that creates X spell when played. The biggest problem with that in that comparison is that Vanguard Sergeant is very proactive. You can play it on the board whenever, and the spell it creates is proactive as well. Whereas Investigator is going to create a Detain in your hand, and Detain's a reactive spell. There's a lot of situations where you're going to want to play Detain with surprise value, or you're going to want to play Detain without having to play a 3/3/3 first, right? Like, you know, let's say on turn 4 or something, you know, they attack into you with Crowd Favorite, and if you're staring down a Mage Seeker Investigator in your hand, you're going to be pretty sad that that's not just a Detain instead. So at the end of the day, this is about the same level as Detain. It might be a little better in some situations, it might be a little worse in others. I would say, On average, I think I would rather run a Detain over this card, but it's pretty close. This card is definitely like a playable option. Mage Seeker Persuader is the last of the 3 Mage Seekers that got changed. This one is a 2-mana 3/2 that, as soon as you've cast a 6+ cost spell this game, gets +1/+1 in Challenger. And this, in my opinion, is probably the strongest out of the 3 of them. A 2-mana 3/2 is already a solid stat line. You know, it's got like its own independent value. And of course, keep in mind, this is a retroactive buff, which means as soon as you play a 6-mana spell, once it's already on the board, you're going to get the +1/+1 on Challenger. So it's going to be pretty common in something, for example, like a Lux Heimerdinger deck to play Mage Seeker Persuader on turn 2, Kempunk Pickpocket on turn 3, float the 2 extra mana from the 1 extra on turn 3 plus the 1 mana on turn 1 into turn 4, and then you've got a total of 6 mana for Remembrance, which is going to, you know, allow your Mage Seeker to get buffed or something like that, right? That's going to be a fairly common line of play, and Mage Seeker definitely feels alright, right? Like the +1/+1 on Challenger is probably going to be the highest impact out of all of these, so this is probably the most competitively viable card out of the 3. Now, you'll definitely see this card seeing some experimentation in, like, you know, Heimer Lux as well as Karma Lux decks. Crowd favorite gets, you know, -1 health. I think this is pretty fair. It's still going to see a lot of play. It's still crowd favorite. It'll turn into like a 6/5 instead of a 6/6, and it's a little bit more dependent on Swarm. Overall, I think this change is fine. You know, it ultimately does hurt aggro decks a tiny bit, but they're still going to play this card. It's still a perfectly fine card. Iceborne Legacy got a very fascinating change where it is now 5 cost. They increased its cost by 2. They made it slow speed, but it grants allies +2/+2 instead of +1/+1. Now, a really weak problem with this card all of a sudden is because it's not burst speed, it is now fizzleable. Now, what that means is if I go to cast this at slow or fast speed, whatever it is, and the opponent denies you of your target by running, by basically stopping that target from existing before this resolves. So, for example, let's say I'm casting this on a spider, a 1/1, and my opponent uses a Vile Feast to kill the spider. The Vile Feast will resolve first. This will try to target a spider that no longer exists because Vile Feast just killed it, and it won't do anything at all. Now, that's a really huge weakness, and this is the entire reason why certain cards like Pack Mentality aren't played. It also allows this card to get denied by anything that deals damage, in addition to, of course, deny, in addition to cards like Will of Ionia that are going to stop this card from having a target regardless. So ultimately, this card basically ends up being a higher payoff with a much, much, much greater risk. Now, there is a theory, by the way, because Ash Arrow has an interesting targeting system where Ash Arrow doesn't happen to be fizzleable. Some people theorize that this card won't be fizzleable and it'll still somehow have, like, targeting abilities. Like, it'll still go off even when they kill your card. I think that's very unlikely, personally, but some people think that it'll end up working like that. It's going to be arguably inconsistent either way. I personally think that the way Ash Arrow works is pretty clear. I mean, it still has the ability to, you know, freeze the rest of the board, even if it loses a primary target, so it makes sense that that's not fizzleable, and Iceborne Legacy has to be fizzleable. Ultimately, this card is not going to be great. I think this is a nerf, although +2/+2 is pretty scary, and there's going to be some situations where you might not be able to bank mana to answer this, right? Also, I'll point out that this is in the same region that runs, you know, Elixir of Iron. So what you're going to do is, you know, you'll move into Iceborne Legacy a Spider. You should be playing this with Spider Swarm, I think, in general. You'll move into Iceborne Legacy a Spider. Your opponent might threaten removal, Static Shock, Mystic Shot, whatever. And then you might have a way to save your Spider from that removal, and that'll be Elixir of Iron, right? That will allow your Iceborne Legacy to go off, and maybe you'll win the game off of that. So that is kind of the one saving grace of this new Iceborne Legacy. Overall, I will try this out. It's going to be unlikely, I think, that it'll perform well. You'll get some surprise value, but at high levels where your opponent saves answers to kill your target on this, I think this will end up being a very, very big waste of mana overall. Pack Mentality gets an interesting bit of a rework where you're no longer targeting an ally. Instead, it's very simply at 7 mana, give all of your allies +2/+2 and overwhelm this round. So it's not targeting based on tribe anymore, and it's not targeting a unit. Specifically, you know, Pack Mentality was fizzleable in the same exact way that Iceborne Legacy was. Now it doesn't target anything, so it's not fizzleable. It makes it a little bit better, but it still has a really weak comparison when you compare it with cards like, you know, Vanguard Sergeant Quadrant, which gives you 4 Demacia, you know, isn't a better color for it when you compare it with like Decisive Maneuver. Overall, I don't think Pack Mentality is really going to be a great card. You know, one comparison that really falls off is Windfarer Hatchling. At 7 mana at slow speed, you know, you're basically getting a free like 4/3 elusive body, which is a pretty big deal in exchange for, of course, not being deniable. But I do think Pack Mentality is kind of in an awkward color. Freljord doesn't really have ways to abuse this too much. Overall, I would say could be a little bit scary. It's sort of like a win for Hatchling, but it's hard to imagine a deck that will actually be running this card for a lot of value. Porosnax gets -1 mana cost. On a normal card, -1 mana cost would be cause for celebration. On Porosnax, it is not. Troupe of LMAX gets neutered into the ground. Now only searches the top 6 cards in your deck, and this will single-handedly remove Elnuks from competitive viability. You're not really going to be seeing too much of this card anymore. The average value on these cards is going to be just too low, and this is definitely pretty happy news for a lot of people. Now, the decks running Troupe of Elnuks are actually several decks. That's like some stuff like Ezreal is going to have to find a new home. Stuff like, for example, you know, a lot of like the kind of Ash decks were slotting in Troupe of Elnuks, even some of the War Mother's control. So Freljord as a color definitely feels weaker because of this. Overall, Freljord feels like it's getting tapped pretty hard here. Navori Conspirator loses 1 power. There's actually a chance this might change the way you build optimal Kinku Wayfinder decks. But overall, for the most part, the same deck is still going to work pretty well. We'll get into that later. Omenhawk plus Conspirator is still a fine combo. And this card is still perfectly runnable, even with 1 less power. Chump Wump, this mostly is going to be hurting Ezreal decks, and I gotta say, the difference between 4 and 3 health is a really big deal, bigger than it probably seems. No longer can it block cards like Zed and cards like Lucian, right? And like, it now gets hit by cards like Brittle Steel. There's so much that can deal 3 damage that, whereas 4 is like a kind of guaranteed 2 for 1, suddenly, this card feels quite vulnerable. As far as like -1 health goes, this is one you are going to feel. Now, Ezreal is still a solid deck. You will still run Chump Wump and Ezreal, but you are going to feel this nerf, I got to say. Flash of Brilliance gets an interesting rework where instead of getting a random spell from the 2 regions that you're in, it gets a random spell that costs 6+ from the 2 regions that you're in. So it's a little bit more predictable what you're going to get. It's going to give you a higher impact card, but there's also a lot of duds that exist at 6+ mana. Overall, some of my friends are arguing about whether this is a nerf or a buff. It's really about the same. It's very close. It'll be easier to kind of predict what your opponent, you know, might have off of their Flash of Brilliance. Sometimes they'll have a bomb like Judgment or Ruination, but it's definitely at least a bit more predictable and less like fully random. Overall, I would say this card is about the same. Some situations a bit better, some situations a bit worse. Rummage, you know, you have the ability now to play it when you have exactly 1 card in your hand to discard 1 and draw 1 instead, which is nice. It's a bit of a buff. It's not going to help its viability in stuff like Ezreal decks, but it will help its viability in discard decks. Okay, then we've got Unstable Voltition, who basically just got his ability. This is not really a rework, but effectively the 6+ cost spell concept got translated into him, which means he works retroactively now. This is a non-competitive card. It's going to have a really hard time working out, and this is not really a buff either. Brood Awakening goes down, -1 mana. This is actually a fairly big deal. It might be runnable in Spider aggro now, although I don't have high hopes for it. The best use of Brood Awakening was and still is going to be the Iceborne Legacy Spider style deck that's going to be running They Who Endure, but for the most part, Brood Awakening as a card that is now costing 5 mana, it's not going to make a difference in most decks. I don't think you can run it in Spider aggro with Noxus, although it's kind of close for sure. And in the Iceborne Legacy deck, well, Iceborne Legacy I think got nerfed, so I don't know if it'll be able to find a home there. And then Mark of the Isles gets a pretty fat nerf, going down to -1/-1, so now it's only +2/+2 instead of +3/+3. And this is a huge nerf overall. I mean, this card definitely feels a lot more fair. It's totally in line. You'll still play this in a lot of decks, but there's a lot of situations where this 1 health will make a gigantic difference, right? Like you're against PNZ, which is kind of the entire reason Mark of the Isles is run as a competitive card. It's the one matchup where you keep it in your opener every time. It's like you go into attack with an Arachnoid Horror, they move in with Mark of the Isle, or sorry, they move in with Mystic Shot, then you Mark of the Isles, and if they have second Mystic Shot, that that's going to feel really bad, right? Or you're jamming new Callista, they get excited her, you mark the Isles, and then when they re-up with Mystic Shot, that's huge value, right? The ability, like, look at that spot, and that's going to be a fairly, not an uncommon spot. It's not common, but it's not an uncommon spot for a card like Mark the Isles. Like, check that out. Like, you're rocking new Callista, right? Okay, they get excited, you know. They threaten your Callista's life, and she was a 4 damage threat. So you mark. Now, on old patch, mark would have been 7 damage, right? 7. Because your Callista survives and then smacks Dome for 7. Absolutely gigantic. New mark threatens 6 under the ability for Mystic Shot to, you know, re-kill the Callista, right? Which means instead of dealing 7 in that spot, it'll deal 0. And that's utterly gigantic. Utterly gigantic. Like, whenever that happens, and don't get me wrong, that's not common. It's not uncommon. Like, that kind of thing will happen a decent amount of the time against PNZ. But it's, like, whenever that happens, it is a complete game swing, right? Like, it's such huge impact when it happens. And every once in a while against PNZ that will happen. That, like, the fact that you're getting 1 less attack and 1 less health does hurt this card a lot, right? It's like, it's harder to block Zed now. Sometimes you could do like a 1/1 spider with mark into Zed or Lucian so that you could kill it because the extra health allows you to survive quick attack. That's a big deal. And of course, just aggro decks in general, this is just going to be dealing 1 less damage in all situations. So it's a pretty big nerf. This card will still exist on the competitive level. You'll still run it in Shadow Isles decks, especially the aggro ones, but it definitely is a blow to that archetype's power level in general. And finally, we have Rekindler, which goes +1 cost. Now, Rekindler is a card that I think did need to get nerfed. It'll still probably be run in like the Garen decks, although I think that deck will be, you know, will feel a pretty big nerf because of it. And it'll still probably be run in the kind of like spooky Karma style decks as well, although you might slot less of it in your deck. For the most part, this is a card that will still exist on the competitive level, but you're going to be seeing less of this card, and you're going to be feeling less of the impact in the decks that it's played in. Anyway, that's the long story short. Patch notes. Now that we've gone through card by card, we can get to talking about decks, meta implications. So let's go ahead and bring up the tier list. This is the tier list website that we have. This is swimstream.com. And basically, in terms of this tier list, this is where we're settled now. I do everything as, you know, I do my due diligence. I do as robust of a process as I can here. I use Mobalytics Masters data to inform the decisions on this tier list. And I talk with a lot of other top players before assigning these tier lists. But of course, this is still predictive. The patch isn't even out yet. We just have patch notes, and this is based on somewhat performance in terms of the last week, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but also it's extrapolating, trying to figure out, you know, what will be good given these changes, and there's always going to be some room for error there. So obviously take this with a grain of salt. Okay, so the easiest thing for me to do is I'm going to be going deck by deck. I'm going to talk about the deck, why it's better, why it's worse, you know, where it is in the meta, or why it's the same. And we're just going to go through this list basically all the way down, and I'll breeze over the tier 3s. So starting off with Kinko Elusives. So this is just like kind of the most standard Kinko Elusives list. And basically, at the end of the day, while this deck did get a little bit worse, overall, it is basically the same. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Pretty much every top deck got a little bit nerfed, so decks that only got a little bit nerfed as opposed to a lot nerfed. Like, some of them, you know, Ezreal loses Knox and Whomped, that's a pretty big deal, right? That's a fairly large nerf. Whereas some other decks, like, for example, fearsome decks that were running a lot of Shadow Isles, you know, they lose Hecarim, they lose Black Spear, they lose Mark of the Isles. And when I say lose, I'm not saying they cut those cards necessarily, but they're losing a lot of power on those cards either way. That's a deck that also feels like it's getting pretty nerfed. So then, you know, enter decks that only get minorly nerfed, like Kinko Elusives, and you've got a recipe for something that's still going to be holding its ground in a meta environment. Yes, Navor Conspirator is going down to 2 attack, but no, this deck isn't going anywhere. This is going to be probably my pick for the best deck in the game. Now, one thing is that now that Conspirator did get nerfed, some people are going to be running other versions of this concept. I actually might try out different versions of Kinko Elusives. For example, Menues also was messing around with a version running 2 Precious Pet and 2 Brothers Bond instead of the Omen Hawk and Elixir of Iron. Of course, cutting Conspirator and replacing it for another Ionia card. That's going to do pretty well as well, right? Because now that Conspirator is a bit worse, suddenly we can definitely experiment with getting out of the Omen Hawk Freljord package. People have tried like Teemo in this kind of deck before, and that's done pretty well in the past. So I do think there's a lot of room for experimentation in terms of what splash this is going to run. I don't think you need to run the Omen Hawk at this point of time, because, you know, cutting the Conspirator now that it has 2 attack, it does feel a bit cuttable. So that's going to be something that sees experimentation, but for now, I'm just going to be listing elusives in, you know, its full glory form, not going anywhere. Bannerman Zed, that's going to be the second deck here, and I'm going to take this moment to remind you guys that, in general, I do try to order things roughly based on their positioning within the tiers, so Kinko Elusives being at the top is not a coincidence. This means if I had to pick, roughly, if I had to pick, this would be kind of the top of tier 1, right? I don't read too much into this. A lot of people might be like, well, but Ezreal's here and Spooky Karma's here, so therefore Ezreal's better than Spooky Karma. And not necessarily, right? Because sometimes it's going to be like a dead even draw and I'm just going to have to randomly pick one to go above. And sometimes it's going to feel like a gap, right? It's like, don't read too much into this, but if I have to pick, you know, it's going to be the higher, the better. All right, so next up, we've got Bannerman Zed, and this is like the kind of 209 style of deck. We've seen it in the past, and this is kind of like a newer version of this concept. Now, basically, it is Allegiance. It's Bannerman deck, similar to Zombie Garen or Garen Rekindler, but it's going to play very, very differently. And the reason for this deck being so different is because this is effectively an aggro list. Even though they look pretty much the same, this list is running excuse me. We're running Cythria, we're running Relentless Pursuit, we're running Radiant Strike, and we're running Purify, right? So this is much more aggressive. This is, yeah, it is basically an aggro style list. And the speed at which it'll be able to play, especially with Relentless Pursuit, this will make it better against decks like Spooky Karma and Ezreal as well, probably. But for the most part, it'll be weak against the mid-range decks. Now, this deck has disappeared for a while. It came on strong, you know, about 2 weeks ago. The reason it disappeared was because Rekindler Garen came on the scene, and basically that's a deck that absolutely ass blasts this mirror. Rekindler Garen will pound this deck sideways because, I mean, they're very similar. They use a lot of the same cards, but I would call this an aggro list, and I would call Rekindler Garen a mid-range deck, and as you can see from our fancy chart here, which this is a rule of thumb, and there's going to be exceptions to this. I might try to, like, clarify this with, like, better examples in the future, but in general, mid-range is going to pound aggro. When you can stabilize a little bit after them, you're going to do very, very well against, you know, the conventional aggro concept, right? So now that Rekindler is a bit nerfed, I'm making the call that this deck might end up being better than that one. Now, it's going to be... That one's a hard choice, right? I'm not really sure. Rekindler Garen's still a powerful tier 2 deck. I think that it's very possible a week from now I'll have swapped them. Bannerman Zed will go down here. Rekindler Garen will go back up here. Who knows? It's kind of debatable how much the +1 mana cost hurts Rekindler. A lot of people are in the camp of, oh, Rekindler Garen's still going to be totally fine, while a lot of other people are in the camp of, wow, this card is kind of garbage now, right? And it's really hard to say. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and put Bannerman Zed as a very powerful kind of aggro or aggressive mid-range deck. Then there's Ephemeral mid-range, and you guys might be a little confused. You might be like, wow, Ephemeral mid-range, you know, that's been kind of like, you know, it's not been performing super well. And then, of course, you've got problems like, for example, I mean, Hakram getting nerfed and Rekindler getting nerfed. I think this deck is going to go through some modifications. But personally, this is a deck that A, performs extremely well on the stats, and B, is very, very difficult to play. So I think it's going to be scaling in terms of those stats as people get better and better about playing it. It's not as much open to playing around. So this is a deck that I think is only going to be on the up and up. And even though you do lose the ability for Hakram to be as reliably valuable, out of all the decks that can run this kind of concept, this is the one deck that can really tap into Hakram's sort of quote-unquote buff, right? Which is to say, you know, like I said, Hakram does get nerfed overall, but when you can level him up, he does arguably get better. So when the Ephemeral combo deck is going to move in with a powerful finisher like Donna Dusk Hakram or Harrowing for maybe multiple Hakrams at that point, when your Hakram is leveled and your board is Ephemeral and attacking, this extra +1 damage on every Hakram aura can be pretty nutty. Because when you Donna Dusk Hakram, you have 3 leveled Hakram auras going off, right? That's a pretty big deal. So out of all the decks, this deck, paradoxically, even though this is the most dependent on Hakram, this is the deck that's probably going to feel the Hakram nerf the least, all right? And the same is true for Rekindler as well, because Rekindler, out of all of its options, you know, sometimes you would resurrect Garen on like turn 5, or turn 6 is like turn 5 Garen into turn 6 Rekindler. That's pretty big sometimes, right? Or sometimes you'd resurrect like Elise or Zed earlier, but for Hecarim, you kind of don't really res until turn 7 at the earliest, right? Which means Rekindler going to 7 mana, out of all the decks in the game, is probably the least felt in a Hecarim deck. So I think this is going to be kind of like the one surviving Hecarim deck, and it will go through slightly different updates and slightly different forms, and I'm just now realizing my webcam is kind of like clipping off the like numbers on this, and that's really, really bad, and I'm going to move it an inch over, and now you can see it, and I'm sorry, I should have noticed that a little bit earlier. My God, I'm really bad at this YouTube thing. Anyway, yeah, so it's going to be, this deck ends up still being very powerful. I'll go over the stats later. We can talk about the stats and how good they are. But this is the deck that has one of the best statistical win rates in Masters. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a stats fiend. I think that there's plenty of situations where the stats are going to be slightly misrepresenting the deck's performance, and you need to be able to key in on that. And I don't think that's one of the cases here. I think that this will still be, in a refined form, a very competitive deck. Especially because, you know, you might find ways to fit in more value out of Ruination. Okay, so then we've got Spider Aggro, and this is the culmination of tier 1 here. Now, Spider Aggro might see some tweaks. We're going to have to see this run in some different forms. For example, it's actually possible that people are going to experiment with cutting Mark of the Isles. I was even thinking about, like, you know, when you compare this card to, like, Transfusion, now that it's a +2/+2, it's kind of like, Transfusion can allow my units to survive, that's kind of neat. I think Mark of the Isles is still a good card, but that's just an example of something people might be messing around with. Overall, crowd favorite after losing 1 health. You will notice that nerf. It will hurt the deck, but ultimately crowd favorite's still a good card that you're still going to play, right? And this is kind of like where a Spider's list, in my opinion, would be at. Heavy on the Noxus. I kind of like the version that will take aggressive cuts on cards like Arachnoid Horror, and I personally like running 2 Crawling Sensation, 2 Elixir of Wrath, and 1 Decimate. The Decimate is quite nice for a bit of surprise value, basically. It means the opponent can't really stabilize very functionally at, you know, 2 or 3 health remaining, or 4, of course, health remaining. Because you might have Decimate, so you might just be able to reduce their clock by 1 when they're not expecting it. And that kind of surprise value is very important for a deck like this. So I do end up liking it in a 1 of capacity. Okay, and that's tier 1, basically. Now, these decks are all decks that have pretty high statistical value, except for Bannerman Zed, this is kind of like a meta call on my part. Honestly, it's a little aggressive. I think that the idea of Allegiance is going to be very, very powerful. So here's the thing. Here's the thing. I think that Demacia Allegiance in general is going to be tier 1. There will be something in Bannerman that's tier 1, and I'm taking a stab in saying it might be Zed. Now, a lot of people are going to mess around with different forms of the Bannerman. You know, there have been Shen decks, there has been Rekindler decks, there have been, like, Elise decks. People have messed around with, like, crowd favorite even, right? I don't know exactly what form of Bannerman is going to be tier 1. I'm randomly guessing it'll be Zed. But that's kind of up for the meta to decide. It'll depend on whether the meta is going to favor a mid-range deck or a slightly more aggressive deck, right? Maybe if Spooky Karma is kind of rising, you want something that's going to be a little bit more aggressive than mid-range. Especially with this style of deck where you have like Relentless Pursuits, right? That's kind of what's going to make the difference in a matchup like that. So basically, this being in tier 1 is just me saying I think that the Demacia Allegiance, Bannerman, is going to be tier 1. It might be this deck. Maybe it'll be Rekindler Garen, so maybe I'll have to swap these. Or maybe it'll be some other thing. Who knows? But this is definitely like, you know, I want to try playing a lot with this deck and seeing how good it'll end up being. All right. So now that we're done with tier 1, let's get into other versions of, you know, concepts, why they're a little bit weaker now. Okay, now we've got Ezreal. So Ezreal is a deck that's gone through a couple of different forms. Now you guys might remember very early forms of Ezreal where I was running Lonely Poro and Poro Herder, and I saw some people like expressing like disbelief or something. I remember like when I made the deck guide for this deck originally way back in the day, I hit I got number 8 master with the Poro version. I remember when I made the deck guide, there was like comments on the YouTube saying like Poros, are you crazy? Are you trolling? And no, I'm not. Lonely Poro is, I mean, obviously I'm not running Poro snacks, and I'm not running, you know, bad cards like Heart of the Fluffed, but Lonely Poro is a valuable, especially like as an anti-aggro tool. Now that fearsomes are less prevalent in the meta, the 1/1 blocker is going to be very valuable, and sometimes even like you'll be able to use the Challenger Poro. Sometimes you can discard them for rummage, and Poro Herda does give you a nice ability to basically pull them into your hand. So there's going to be a few different ways of playing Ezreal now that LMAX are being nerfed. This is one that I personally like. This is something I've had a lot of success with in the past. And of course, we've got Kempunk Pickpockets to effectively carry through our kind of like early mid game. I might boost this to like a second rummage as well. But I am going to be doing a bit of a trial to determine what the best forms of playing Ezreal are, and there are many. So we're going to have to get into this now because I have to talk about all the different flavors of Ezreal. There is Knox, Draven, Ezreal. That's a pretty powerful deck. There is Karma Ezreal, which I'm a little bit more hesitant on, but it actually does have some potential. And even Shadow Isles Ezreal, even after the Rekindler got nerfed, has some potential as a deck as well. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and show off the versions of Knox as well as Karma Ezreal. So let's go ahead and pull that up. So we've got Knox Ezreal here. Now this is a version of Ezreal that will basically play a bit faster. It's better against like the aggro style decks. You'll find your combo earlier. You tend to control the board a little bit more early. And I tend to not like it as much against like the slower decks like Spooky Karma, for example. And how this version is going to work is you're going to use Arachnoid Sentry in lieu of Iceveil Archer. You have some options in terms of like Culling Strike and Noxian Guillotine that are going to be potentially scooping up some value. But the big appeal for Knox is Draven. Basically, the endless supply of spinning axes you get in your hands will be enabling your rummage. And there's even going to be interesting spots in the late game where your 0-mana spinning axe will be how your Ezreal burst will be finishing off the game, right? Draven's, generally speaking, a very, very powerful tool, and you're going to be able to threaten a lot of, value with him because every time you attack, your opponent can't really block very easily, typically, because he has quick attack and the threat of spinning axes in your hand. But often you're just going to be rummaging away like the jury rigs as well as the little axes that you get from Draven. So this is Knox Ezreal. So then, of course, moving over to Karma Ezreal. So this is the version that Saizu, I'm saying that super, super wrong, some Polish streamer got to #1 on ladder with. I gotta say, I'm personally not a huge believer in this list. I think that it gets a lot of surprise value. It's going to do well into some matchups. It's better against like the Spooky Karma. But overall, I don't have like super high expectations for this. Yon is alright. It's a card that is going to do very, very well if the opponent, doesn't really respect its value. And it's one of the largest reasons to be in this color combination in general. And there is a very, very cute thing you can do where Ezreal does get lifesteal off of Spirit's Refuge. That will very rarely matter. Of course, you've got Ezreal. Basically, when he levels up, it is when you cast a spell, if he has the lifesteal on the Spirit's Refuge, this ability will begin to lifesteal. Which is pretty crazy, because that means every time, let's say you Mystic Shot the opponent's face, it'll deal 4 damage to them, and it'll heal you for 2, right? That's pretty cute. It's, really, really adorable. For the most part, though, it's kind of overkill, and it's really rare that you're in a spot with Ezreal where you need to be healing off of your ability as well. It's just a neat interaction that will sometimes matter. Overall, I think that, a lot of people disagree about this one. The stats are showing that, this version of Ezreal isn't very good. The stats don't like this version of Ezreal. That being said, there's a very fair argument that the stats are biased because this version is harder to play. I might also say that the opposite argument applies to the surprise value that this deck will get via people not playing around cards like Yon properly. But either way, this is an option on Ezreal. At the end of the day, whether you think, X version or is a little bit better than Y version, they're very close, right? All 3 versions of Ezreal are pretty roughly comparable to each other. So ultimately, this is just one other way you have of playing Ezreal. Now back to the site, and let me explain a little bit why the deck is currently listed as this. First of all, Freljord is just kind of generally the most stable version of Ezreal. It's pretty similar to, how we listed, the Freljord version of Kinko Elusives before. It's just kind of like what is, I guess, effectively speaking, tried and true. I know it's going to seem sort of weird to a lot of you guys who haven't seen much of this deck, but Lonely Poro was standard in this before the LMAX were added in, and that was a change by Mago. And effectively I'm reverting back to it. Now, I can almost guarantee you that in a week's time, the Ezreal version of the site is going to look somewhat different from this. Maybe it'll be a different version of Freljord. Maybe it'll look like Karma. Maybe it'll look like Draven. Could even be some weird thing with Zai. There will be some kind of like competitive, pretty high tier Ezreal deck, and it's really hard to say which version is going to end up being the best one. I'm going to go ahead and default to the Freljord version, which is pretty good, and it is a great pick for, you know, what's going to be good for Ezreal moving forward. But you're absolutely free to choose whichever of the Ezreal versions you want from the ones I showed off. I mean, they're all great decks. For a lot of guys who like probably watch a lot of Twitch, you guys might be like, you know, being like, Swim, you're just being edgy. Karma Ezreal's, you know, a lot of streamers agree Karma Ezreal's pretty good. And it's important to understand I'm talking with a ton of players and not all of them are streamers. For example, Mago and Gummy, which are two very high level Ezreal players, both like Freljord Ezreal as the best version even after LMAX get nerfed, right? And a lot of people are going to be running Heimerdinger with this concept as well. Yeah, and who knows, maybe Heimerdinger is actually the best way to play Ezreal. I mean, there's very similar versions of, you know, this Ezreal Freljord concept that are going to be running like Heimerdinger Flash of Brilliance. That was a common variant. I played that for a while. It fell off mostly due to Knox and the same thing, but it's also very common on Asian servers or so I've been told, so that's definitely one other option this deck could take. Anyway. Moving on, we've got Spooky Karma. Now, Spooky Karma is a kind of full control deck that didn't actually feel this nerf very much. Now, some people might say, well, what about Mark of the Islands? Well, Mark of the Islands was not run in high-level versions of this deck, and I think hasn't been for some time. Like, Mago, for example, hasn't been running it in this deck. I haven't been running it in my Spooky Karma deck for at least a week now. So, Mark of the Isles is not really a big loss for this deck, right? In fact, it isn't one at all. Rekindler, well, I mean, you do run the Rekindler, so it's going to cost 1 more mana sometimes, but you usually don't need to resurrect Karma right away. You'll often have Mystical for that, and, you know, if there's ever a deck that doesn't really care that much about paying 1 extra mana sometimes, it's certainly this one. So, Rekindler still ends up feeling fine here. So overall, this is a deck that feels pretty great right now. It ultimately didn't really get nerfed very much at all. It's still a powerful control Shadow Isles concept. It might be the strongest control deck in the game. It is a pretty powerful high tier deck, but it's very tricky to play, so it's kind of hard to recommend. And I think the stats are going to reflect that because this deck does not have a super high win rate on the stats. It's an okay win rate, but it's not as high as I definitely think it could be when it's in the right hands, which is part of the reason it's in tier 2 here, because this tier list is not necessarily for the top level gameplay, it is for the high level gameplay, right? At the end of the day, even though this, I think, when piloted by a very good player, is a tier 1 deck, I think that ultimately for kind of like, you know, the average high-level player, which is like low masters or high platinum or high diamond, overall, it is going to be a deck that won't be able to perform, and the stats are going to reflect that. Okay, so I've lumped it into tier 2 for that reason. Heimer Karma is, of course, a pretty powerful kind of like Karma alternative, and as we can see, we can play like Ezreal Karma as well. This is a version of the deck that I think basically will end up seeing 0 change. Ultimately, like none of these cards really got changed. It is just a Heimer Karma list through and through. You can just run effectively the good old Heimer Karma that we know and love. And it is a deck that has definitely felt like it's come up in win rate somewhat in the past several weeks, right? It is, well, it's been up and down. I should actually clarify that. It's not like necessarily always on the rise, but it consistently does well against Kinko elusives as well. Oh yeah, I also forgot to mention earlier in this video, I do have, this is still a bit of a work in progress, so huge grain of salt here. Huge grain of salt. But I do have my matchup tables that is currently on the site. Now, this is not statistical win rate. This is estimated win rates by polling a lot of top players. So it's going to be somewhat, again, grain of salt. But for the most part, you are going to be able to see general trends. And as we can see, for example, like Heimer Karma, and I'll talk about this section later, but Heimer Karma against Kinko elusives is pretty favored. It feels like it's a pretty solid counter to the deck in general, because you usually, if you play it right, you usually have good ways of being able to block enough of their cards with your Heimerdinger, and they don't really have a lot of ways to kill your Heimerdinger. They can use Will of Ionia to stall it, and that's about it. So Heimer Karma, especially kind of because it's latching onto Kinko Elusives as a decent counter to that deck, and Kinko Elusives kind of on the rise, Heimer Karma will stabilize as a pretty solid tier 2 deck. Then Rekindler Garen. Overall, this was at the top for a while, a very, very powerful like mid-range Demacia deck. Rekindler losing 1 mana, or gaining 1 mana cost is definitely going to hurt this one. Now, it's a very powerful list. We're going to have to see. It's going to be a competition on basically what the best Bannerman list is going to be. This is one of the contenders. But for now, I'm happy to just slot it into a tier 2 capacity. Then we've got Discard Swarm, and this is a version that I particularly quite like, and this is from my boy Menues. And basically, it's doing something very weird for Discard. I think this is a hard-to-play form of aggro, but effectively, we are cutting out Burn, that's a Mystic Shot, and Get Excited for Swarm, for, you know, House Spiders, Battlecasters, and crowd favorites. And I gotta say, I think this is just a better version, period. I think that Burn in this game has definitely felt very underwhelming. I felt that from early on, you know, even in my Prankster Burn deck, I cut Get Excited for the same reason. I don't really like the idea of direct damage Burn as much as a lot of other people do, and I'm very down for the idea of playing a more swarmy kind of discard package. I've always felt that discard has a lot of untapped potential if built in a very particular way, and this is my current favorite way to build a list. Now, it's fairly untested, so it is going to need to, you know, we're not going to see a bunch of stats on this one, and there's a lot of people playing like different forms of discard, so it's going to be hard to say exactly where this is, but it definitely could end up dethroning Spider aggro as the kind of like go-to tier 1 aggro deck. As the list gets more refined, people learn how to play it better. Of course, it's really hard to predict these things because, you know, you can't tell how much of win rate is coming because, you know, the person playing the deck is good versus bad versus having some surprise value. Maybe it's going to be a lot more countered when people realize how to play around it. Very difficult to say, but for now, I think I'm happy to recommend it in general. Not ready to give it tier 1 status quite yet, but it is showing a lot of potential as an aggro deck. Fearsome Rally is definitely a deck that I'm still listing here just because a lot of people are kind of continuing playing this kind of concepts, but off of the nerfs of Mark of the Isles, Black Spear, and Hecarim, I think it's about time to hang up the, what's the expression? Hang up the goat? I don't think that's the expression. It's about time to hang up the goat on this list. I think that's about where we're at. Like, between just getting nerfed in 3 different areas, I was hesitant to even continue listing this one on the tier list at all. It still will be able to win you some decent amount of games, but as you can see, it's fairly low here because I can't quite recommend it. And then we've got a couple of slightly weaker decks here. We've got the Barrier Challenger, as well as Prankster Burn that I've listed in tier 3 right now. Barrier Challenger just being, you know, a fairly weak concept. I'm actually a little disappointed. I thought this deck would have more staying power, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of different ways to kind of build this. There's like JJ, who made this version, and then there's like 6O's version that runs the Allegiance. But overall, I think Demacia ends up with better options than these, as shown by like the kind of Zed Splash Allegiance or Rekindler Splash Allegiance Zombie Garen style decks. So ultimately, this is definitely a decent deck, but it's not performing well in stats, and I don't have high hopes for this deck moving forward, as well as Prankster Burn, which is definitely an alright deck. It's actually not, like, you could see it as a tier 2 deck, but ultimately this deck did get a little bit hurt by the fact that Mark of the Isles got dinged, and that is definitely the kind of thing that this deck will feel. Mark of the Isles, definitely the -1/-1 on its ability is something that will absolutely swing a very noticeable amount of games, right? Okay, and then we've got our meme section down here, which honestly I'm not going to cover, except to say, rest in pieces, Fuck. You will be missed. You will be missed. I'm sorry. It wasn't your time. It wasn't your time, Fuck. Meme decks just getting fucking collateral damage out here. Unbelievable. I can't stand it. I can't stand to see it, but there's no other fate for this one, guys. It's gotta go. I'm sorry. Alright, guys. Anyway, that is effectively the breakdown. So if you want to check out the matchup sections, you can go ahead and visit the site. I'm going to be tweaking this matchup sections as I go. There are probably a couple entries here that I do need to tweak out. And again, this is anecdotal, so I think it will be a somewhat useful resource for some people. A lot of people will just have the impression of, yeah, it's not statistics, so it's useless. And honestly, It's not super useful, no. It's not going to be like a huge revelation. I don't think that the data is at the point where this would be like a crazy huge revelation. I think eventually we will have a bigger sample size, and I think Mobile Dicks will eventually be able to pull the data for individual matchup win rates. We're not at that point yet. I think the in-game API needs to be improved for that to be possible, as far as I know. So I hope to eventually have that, but until then, I think this will still be a nice resource for players looking, when you're on ladder and you're like, man, I really just want to counter this deck. What can I play to just, I keep seeing this deck and I fucking hate it. Let's counter this, Check out the matchup table and you'll probably be able to find a deck that has a favorable win rate against it. Alright guys, so that is kind of the tier list portion of the video, and now I'm gonna give you guys a sneak peek into the Masters stats for the past week. Now again, keep in mind, finally, we're gonna be extrapolating based off of these, so at the end of the day, the tier list is not only based on these stats, but also based on predictions on where the meta is gonna end up. And as always, the link to this sheet, you can see yourself the March 9th through March 16th week Masters Mobalytics data is going to be publicly available. You can find it in the pinned comment in the description. Now, let's go ahead and break this down. So, these are games played over here, these are deck names, these are regions, and these are the champions, right? And of course, we've got the almighty win right here. As we can see, Kinko Elusives is king of the castle at a whopping 61.5% win rate. Pretty broken. And Ephemeral midrange, I mentioned before, is standing strong at an almost 60% win rate, despite being a very tricky deck to play optimally. So even though it arguably gets a little bit nerfed, now you can see why. I still feel like this ends up being a tier 1 deck. Rekindler Garen is down from last week. It's at 55, and I think it ends up being a bit more counterable now that people are familiar with how to play around it. In a lot of cases, you can avoid giving Rekindler huge value by, just making sure you are intentionally killing their, not going out of your way to kill their card to enable their Rekindler. As soon as people know exactly what the deck is, they're able to play around it. And as a card's play rate goes up, its win rate will always go down. That's always going to be true. Although, of course, that's kind of like long-term and theoretical stats. Sometimes the practical data is going to vary wildly, but not in any sort of useful way. So, Rekindler Garen, this is part of the reason I ended up bumping this deck to tier 2, because I think that now that Rekindler cost 7, there's going to be different explored options for how to splash that color with the Bannerman Allegiance, as well as it's just a little bit down in the stats. Spooky Karma actually representing one of the highest in this case, games played from this data collection with a bit of a low win rate. I'm still going to keep it standing strong at tier 2 because, like I say, I do think it is a powerful deck when in the right hands, and I think it will get better in this new meta environment as well. It doesn't do amazingly into Kinko Elusives, which is going to be one of the meta decks, but it does pretty well against Demacia decks, and Demacia is going to have a pretty good controlling share of the meta. Okay. As we can see, Ezreal is still maintaining a high win rate. Although, you might say once Elnux and Chungus Wungus are out, Ezreal's definitely on the tumble down. And you might be right. Ezreal might actually just be a falling off concept. There's a lot of people that think Ezreal's time is kind of like coming to an end. And even when you run it in like a slightly different deck, I don't know if it'll be able to get the same representation in terms of like the meta share that it once had. For example, as you can see, Ezreal Karma has a decent win rate, but it's not as high as it was, and this is off, I would say, getting some amount of like surprise value into the meta. Again, as play rate goes up, win rate pretty much is always going to go down. Not necessarily in a practical sense, but the theoretical win rate will always go down as the play rate goes up, right? Okay, so this is kind of where we're at. Spider aggro holding strong. It's 60 win rate flat. Now, this is currently rocking a tier 1 status on my tier list, but it's pretty close to the bottom, and I might bump it down. The crowd favorite losing 1 health and the Mark of the Isles losing, 1 and 1 is a pretty big hit to Spider aggro, so we'll have to see if this is going to survive in another form or maybe possibly get dethroned by like discard kind of swarm style deck, right? And we've got Heimer Karma, which is down in win rate from last week, but last week it was actually rocking a really, really stable win rate, I believe 58% if I'm remembering correct, or maybe I'm thinking 2 weeks ago. It's down in its win rate, but I actually do think that this deck will end up stabilizing pretty well. And then there's burn aggro, which I think is probably going to get assimilated by the discard swarm aggro. This is probably going to have inferior tables to that in pretty much every way. Anyway, this is kind of like the general breakdown we've got here. We have War Mother's Control, kind of a lot of decks I'm not going to mention because they have like weak stats. This is a good reason why you don't play Yasuo, for example. You know, like, yeah, don't do that. But yeah, this is where we are on the stats. If you want to check the sheet for yourself, like I said, I'm going to pin it in the comments. And that's basically it. That is this week's Meta Monday. I consider this to be on time. Honestly, Tuesday is on time. Last week was late. Next week, maybe we'll be early and maybe we'll actually put it out on the Mondays. But I'm really looking forward to the patch. I have a slight concern that the meta is just going to not even necessarily shift, but if anything, consolidate, and we might be looking at an even less diverse meta in the long run than we have currently. But I actually like where we're at right now. With Ephemeral Midrange, I think that the Ephemeral Midrange will actually be a surviving deck that's going to play fairly differently. King Elusives is still king, and honestly, I would be lying if I said I didn't wish it was, or is that too many negatives? You know what I mean. I'm not, you know, I kind of wish this deck didn't exist right now, but, you know, what can I do? But overall, I'm looking forward to the new patch. I'm looking forward to messing around with a lot of specific cards. You guys might notice that I'm coming. You guys might notice I kind of didn't really want to draw a lot of attention to this personally, but I don't think a lot of these like new exciting things are actually going to be good. As I mentioned, I don't think new Callista is going to be good at all. And I don't think the Mage Seekers are really going to be good. I think there's some potential in this one and maybe this one. And like I said, I'll mess around with running Insider in like a Knox deck. That could actually be kind of sweet, but I don't have big expectations overall. And of course, Iceborne Legacy is, if anything, probably closer to a nerf than a buff, although there are definitely some arguments as to how that could be a buff. So overall, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but I mean, my honest opinion is like all this exciting stuff is probably not going to be super powerful. I mean, you guys might wonder why there's no Mage Seeker decks here, and I don't have high expectations for it. And the same is true with Callista. But overall, it'll be nice kind of seeing where things worked out. Of course, next week we'll be able to see where we were right about the meta, where we were wrong in our predictions, and that's always a fun process. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. That's about all I got this time, boys. Keep it real, keep it 100, and I'll see you guys next time.